We meet our first recorded Plampyn with John Plampyn I, born around 1430 in a village called Stoke-by-Nayland in Suffolk, England. The name Suffolk comes from the original ancient settlements in East Anglia. The Suffolk we know today was Southfolk back then, and today's Norfolk was Northfolk. You'll notice the spelling difference of our surname. Before the advent of printing and dictionaries, a person's name was recorded by sound, often with many variations during a single lifetime. The name Plampyn was one of the names brought to England in the wave of migration after the Norman conquest of 1066. The Plampyn family originated in Pavilion, near Nantes, in Normandy. In French, the name literally means of the pavilion or tent. The word pavilion comes from the Latin word for butterfly, capturing the way a tent spreads out like the wings of a butterfly. There is little recorded about John Plampyn, so we rely on the history of the time to guide us. John lived for 40 years, an average lifespan for the times. During his life, Suffolk went through social upheaval. There had been waves of the deadly plague that had decimated the population. England was mostly agrarian at this time, with most people working in some way on the land. They did so in a long-held mutual relationship with the landholders. In return for backbreaking labour on the estates, work that made the landowners wealthy, the labourers were given access to communal or common ground on the estate. Here they could freely graze and tend to their animals and grow crops, after the master's work was done, of course. But after the plagues, when labour was in short supply, farmer workers began to demand higher wages. Suddenly, the great estates became less profitable, so landowners began to look for alternatives. London was continuing to grow, as was the demand for woolen cloth. Sheep farming required much less labour than the traditional mixed farms, so the landowners seized the opportunity to convert to sheep. Sheep required secure boundaries to keep them on the farm. In a wave called the early enclosures, landowners hedged and walled off their properties, effectively shutting out their workers from the commons. The impact was devastating. The workers could no longer supplement their meagre wages. They could not support their families. They were forced to leave the homes their families had held for generations and seek alternative work. Because most estates were converting to sheep, workers had little option but to seek work where they could, in the new fulling woolen mills, or even begging. Their villages on the estates were left abandoned. Yet this social upheaval provided opportunities for some farm staff who had savings. Sheep can be profitable on more marginal land. Landholders found that they had good land to spare, so they sought to increase their income by leasing surplus land to anyone who could afford it. In this way, a new class of person rose from farm labourers. This was the yeoman, who through modest beginnings leased land, made a profit, bought land, kept more profit, gained more wealth, and started to afford some of the privileges of the aristocracy. Privileges such as education for their children in the new schools and colleges like Eton and Cambridge. This was the fledgling middle class, in between the aristocracy who had held all the land, and the workers forever tied to menial jobs, poverty, and the grace of their master. It's hard to be sure that this leg up occurred for our 13th great-grandfather, John Plampyn, but it seems possible, given there are no recorded titles against his name, while there are for his offspring. There is also no record of John's wife, as was common to the times. There is, however, a record of the birth of his son, John Plampyn II, our 12th great-grandfather, born in 1495, also in Stoke-by-Nayland. What sort of England was John II born into? Happily, it was a time of unprecedented peace, ruled over by King Henry VII from the House of Tudor. Unlike today, back in the 1400s, there was no single line that was guaranteed the throne. Battles were constantly fought between local armies loyal to different houses, in an effort to secure the crown and ultimate power. In the 30 years before Henry VII took the throne, England had gone through the Wars of the Roses, a bitter series of battles between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Those prolonged wars only ended when Yorkist Richard III was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, leaving Henry VII to take the crown. Henry's claim to the crown by bloodline was dubious. His ancestry had two illegitimacies in it, but by removing his rival Richard in battle, his path to the throne was cleared. Henry VII went on to rule for 18 years, unheard of in the previous years of constantly changing kings. The peace that came from a stable crown paved the way for progress. It was an important age for founding schools and colleges like Eton, King's College, and Cambridge. The Inns of Court systematized the teaching of law. William Caxton was developing his printing press that would bring newspapers and books to larger audiences. Architecture began to show great originality. As wool began to make regions rich, large churches were built in an ongoing, original perpendicular style. A beautiful example of this is King's College Chapel, built when our John was 16 years old. So what of our ancestor John Plampyn II? While records this far back are still sketchy, we know John was born in 1495, 4 years after the future King Henry VIII was born. We know John was a Sir, a knight. His life would have centered around military prowess, land ownership, and upholding chivalry. Depending on his father's circumstances, John II may have inherited his title at his father's death in 1523. 1 year later, 29-year-old John married 19-year-old Maud Goodall at Stoke-by-Nayland, most likely at the beautiful St. Mary's Church. And it was at that church that the couple celebrated the christening of our 11th great-grandfather, 1 year later in 1525. Sir John Richard Thomas Plampyn III started and ended his 38-year-long or short life in Stoke-by-Nayland, just like his father and his father's father before him. When John was 9, England broke away from centuries of Catholic rule, when King Henry VIII declared himself, not the Pope, the supreme head of the Church of England. This was not from an idealistic belief. Henry simply wanted to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon so he could marry the next of his 6 wives. Divorcing wives was not approved of by the Pope, so Henry simply declared himself in charge to get his own way. We know John III benefited from a good education and went on to study at Cambridge University, although there's no record of him graduating. A year after the death of his mother, Maud, in 1548, John married 24-year-old Lady Elizabeth Frances Kellaway at Stoke-by-Nayland in St. Mary's Church. John and Elizabeth had 5 children together, twins John and Thomas, with John being our 10th great-grandfather, twins Dorothy Ann and Robert George, and the last child Susan, born in 1560. This is the same year that Lady Elizabeth died. One can only wonder if she died giving birth to baby Susan. This was common in these times, with 25 to 30% of birthing women dying from prolonged labor, hemorrhaging, or postnatal infections. Infant mortality was also very high, with a quarter of infants not reaching 5 years old. Happily, all of John and Elizabeth's 5 children survived. One of the girls died, aged 36-year-old, quite possibly in childbirth, while the rest lived to their 60s, quite an advanced age for the times. Notably, they all died in 1618 or 1619. Records show an outbreak of bubonic plague at the time, believed to have arrived with rats in grain imported from America and shipped along the rivers Orwell and Stour. Remember this name, Orwell, as we will meet someone with this name in a further episode, when we explore the Chadacre Plampyns. In an interesting aside, completely unrelated to any Plampyns, the writer Eric Blair chose the pen name George Orwell, under which he would become famous because of his love for the River Orwell. At the time of Lady Elizabeth's death, she left behind 10-year-old twins, 5-year-old twins, and a newborn. It was quite common in these times for men to quickly remarry to provide a solution to raising children bereaved by maternal death. Our 11th great-grandfather did exactly that. He remarried under a year later in the church at Stoke by Nayland. All we know of his second wife is her name, Marian Oakley. Often these second marriages were more pragmatic than romantic. We hope Marian was kind and generous of heart to her stepchildren, in particular to John, our 10th great-grandfather, because sadly, only 3 years after this marriage, 13-year-old John and his siblings lost their father, John III, leaving them biologically orphaned.